Welcome to the continuation of the Young Scholars of Turkey program. Welcome to our co-sponsors, SETA DC. This is I can't remember which number in the lectures is this now. Number 9 in these lectures, and we've been it's sort of a blur.
Eight. Something like that.
See, a lucky 8.
8.5.
Sounds like a movie. We're lucky today, or we're fortunate today, to have Judd King with us in this continuation of the program. I'm David Cathell of the Institute of Turkish Studies, for those of you who might not know me. Welcome, and we have some extra spaces up front for those of you who are not particularly shy. Come up, it's closer if you feel like it. I have I've had the pleasure of having known Judd for a number of years now, and can vouch that he is a very bright guy. He has a good take on many aspects of Turkish society, and he also has very interesting views. So I've been looking forward to this paper for quite some time. The topic of today's is dynamics of Islamic public opinion in Turkey. We all talk about Islamic public opinion, but to a great extent, no one really seems to talk about it in a coherent way. There's a lot that's been bandied about in the press, particularly in the press over the last 5 or 10 years, in terms of Islamic thought and the Islamic politics and the like. But a lot of times it's just a catchword and it doesn't particularly go very deep. So I'm looking forward to this afternoon's paper, and without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over ever so briefly to Judd King, and I will be prodding him because we do need to have Q&A at the end.
All right.
Welcome.
Well, thank you. Hi and welcome to everybody, and thanks to SETA DC for having me here today. I'm going to be talking, as Dr. Cathell just said, about basically the moral psychology of political Islam, and basically the microdynamics of how people's religious and political motivations are sort of intertwined. Particularly with regard to Turkey, but I do think this also has clear implications for elsewhere, and for example the emerging new order we've been seeing in the Arab world, whatever that's going to end up being. I think it's relevant. Before continuing, I am going to issue a caveat that research is very much still a work in progress. So I won't have all of the answers now, and not everything I say can be entirely definitive. But I am still always right about everything, so don't worry about any of that. Yes, don't fact check that one, by the way. Okay, so basically over the last 10 years, Islam has been an increasingly visible alternative to what was once a sort of meticulously secular public culture in Turkey. Nowadays you have Islamic fashion shows, you have Islamic newspapers, there's even an Islamic soap opera, which is kind of weird. But at the same time, the main quote-unquote Islamist party, the AK party, which has been in power for the last 10 years, has basically been increasingly moderate, and they've avoided the kind of direct confrontations with the state that got, especially with the secular establishment, that got their predecessor parties sort of closed down, especially the Refah party. Many people are still suspicious, though, that the moderation they've been showing is basically a facade that masks some radical Islamic agenda of some sort, and particularly because many of the supporters increasingly differentiate themselves by living a self-consciously Islamic lifestyle, many people are kind of concerned that it could turn into another Iran. My focus here is less on the dynamics of the party itself and more on the sort of more elusive issue of public opinion, and especially the opinion of the people that are voting for the AK party, who I interviewed extensively over the summer. So they're kind of the dominant voice within the Turkish voting public at the moment, and the question is, are they Islamist? And if so, what does that mean? So first of all, what is Islamism? And probably the simplest definition is the sort of slogan of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Islam huwa al-hal, meaning Islam is the answer. It's most basically Islam as an ideology, a sort of comprehensive plan meant to provide answers, explanations, and prescriptions for every possible facet of life. And at the core of the definition is that a true Islamist believes that the only legitimate source of moral value is Islamic scripture, and that anything not firmly rooted in that scripture, or at the very least, clearly compatible with it, should be rejected as some sort of evil foreign invention. This is, it might sound a little silly, but this definition is actively used by scholars such as Ernest Gellner, and it has a lot of sort of currency, and it's sort of meaningful. So it can sort of describe two sort of distinct phenomena. One of them is fundamentalism, which I don't really like that term because it has negative connotations, but asking your indulgence in advance, I am going to use it because it's distinct from political Islam. Fundamentalism is more generally sort of the lifestyle and sort of ideology, but it's not necessarily applied to the state, whereas political Islam really seeks to create a more Islamic society through the state. So one of the main sort of policy worries, especially in the West, that a lot of people have is that anybody that genuinely meets these definitions of sort of fundamentalism or political Islamism would basically present a real challenge for democracy, insofar as they believe that the right to make laws rests with God and not with people. So that obviously there are some problems there. So how do we know that the people that are sort of quietly rejecting secularism in their everyday lives, or at least the secular state establishment in Turkey, through the clothes they wear, their food, their drink, even their toothpaste, how do we know that they're not really these committed, crazy Islamists that want to, change everything politically? My answer is because, actually, Islamists as such don't really exist. At least not in line with those definitions. And I arrived at this conclusion basically through the moral psychological theories of Dr. Jonathan Haidt and my own fieldwork. So, throughout most of history, philosophers, psychologists, and others have basically usually regarded morality as sort of a rational matter that's concerned with reasoning, where based on basically the application of certain principles to particular problems. In the case of Islamism, such a view would suggest that because Islamists believe that the Quran and Sunnah are the only valid sources of moral authority, when they're confronted with a moral choice, they should consult the scripture to find the answer, and that should really be their first sort of thing that they do. And that is also in accord with the old tradition of Islamic law, which operates according to the same principles. So, if, for example, somebody is to offer them pork, they might recall the verse in the Quran that says, "Don't eat pork." And then they'd say, okay, well, it says in the Quran, don't eat pork, so I won't eat it. If somebody offers them beer, they could recall the verse that says, you should avoid wine, and then they could recall also the hadith, the saying of the Prophet, that said that for legal purposes, anything that gets you drunk counts as wine, so they could say, therefore, I shouldn't drink the beer either. In essence, this process is strictly rational, at least given the major sort of assumption that the Quran and Hadith represent God's definitive moral commands to humanity. Dr. Haidt, however, seriously challenges this presumption with his research, and posited that, in fact, morality is not at all a rational process of examining reasons and forming conclusions, but it's actually an emotional process in which the judgment is made intuitively, with reasons being brought in later to justify it. He proved this theory by asking subjects a variety of carefully designed moral questions, which were in which people did shocking and disgusting things, but that were ultimately sort of harmless. So, and I apologize in advance, this is a little gross, but his example, one of them, this is one of the cleaner ones, was that an adult brother and sister decide to have intercourse. They use two forms of birth control and enjoy themselves, but they never repeat the action or tell anyone about it. Is what they did wrong? And overwhelmingly, the people he talked to said, well, yeah, of course that's wrong. The thing was, when he asked them why it was wrong, they didn't know. And even after a lot of them confessed that they didn't know why it was wrong, they still maintained that it was wrong. Now, the very existence of something that you know is wrong, but you don't know why it's wrong, basically completely confounds the entire rationalist model of morality, because, I mean, if you don't have a reason for something, how could you possibly have arrived at that conclusion by weighing evidence? So, yeah. Instead, what Haidt argues goes on is there are these intuitive processes which result from individual temperaments, socialization, mood. He actually demonstrated that if people smell something bad, they come out with harsher moral judgments for some reason, and especially cultural influence, though. And these provide people with a sort of almost instinctive moral matrix, so they know immediately when somebody does something wrong. Rationality does enter the picture, though, in two ways. First of all, it's sometimes necessary to sort of sort through competing moral impulses, which may conflict with one another, and that's sort of internally, in which case reason sort of tells you which thing should have priority over the other. And the second is that when you need other people to do something, usually they need reasons other than I say so. So, you know, in that case, the rational mind works ex post facto to sort of justify to the other person what it was that intuitively you'd already determined was right. Now, certainly it should be noted that when that happens, people often try to connect their point to a broader discourse which would have more emotional resonance. So if somebody asks, why should I not engage in usury, the possible answer could include, because God has forbidden it. That's a religious sort of discourse. Another answer could be, because it exploits the poor, which is, you know, would connect it to sort of maybe leftist class struggle sort of things. I don't know. But you can see that they're different sort of discourses. They, like I said, they sort of help people to resolve competing moral impulses or to convince others to take a particular action. Now, there's two key implications. First, although humans usually do a very good job of hiding it, by using these discourses and tying everything into other things, human morality is fundamentally not rationally consistent. While you can sort of draw a best fit line between different values, in fact, the geography of where these things fall doesn't really follow much of a rhyme or reason. So, second, any claim that says that a single coherent discourse, for example Islam, can actually encapsulate the sum total of any human being's moral values is immediately very suspect. And there are almost always very clear cracks that you can find in it if you look carefully. So I took the same principle and applied it to the conservative Muslims in Turkey. This refrain that we hear both from Islamists and people that criticize Islamists, that for these people Islam is completely everything, at least morally speaking, really warrants some serious scrutiny. So I went to Turkey last summer and conducted my field work, and I basically interviewed 30 people for about 2.5 to 3 hours, and they were basically selected on the criteria that they had to have voted both for the AK party and the previous Refah party, which would sort of ensure that they were from the quote-unquote Islamic core of the party, that had voted for the more Islamist party beforehand, but that hadn't broken off to be like with the super crazy people that, you know, have kind of moved a little even farther since then and don't really get many votes. So without exception, they were all conservative Muslims in some sense. Overwhelmingly, they observed the 5 daily prayers, and that being said, though, their levels of education, class status, and income varied hugely. So I was looking for two things, mainly, first of all, for the specific content of their opinions on both political and social issues, and especially beyond that, it's crucial for me to find out how they talked about politics and society, and their personal lives, and especially what kinds of discourses they used. Now, I haven't systematically analyzed all of the interviews yet, so I don't really have precise statistics generally, but basically what I found is that even if many people answer that being a good Muslim is the key to the most important thing to teach their children, or even the key to a happy marriage, Islam is definitely not the only way people talk about things, or even necessarily the primary one. For example, people overwhelmingly agreed that voting is a duty. And when I asked them what kind of a duty, they said, well, it's a duty of citizens, you know, you have to participate in the government, democracy doesn't work if you don't vote, that sort of a thing. No mention of Islam at all, even though, you know, you could have said that. There's a well-known hadith that I think a lot of people know that says that whoever is not interested in the affairs of a people is not one of them. But nobody said that, they said democracy. Now, democracy is a very important theme that came up repeatedly. And it may not be so surprising that it wasn't described in particularly Islamic terms. But what is interesting is that by far the most common explanation for opposition to the official ban on headscarves in universities was democracy, and that it violated women's rights to wear what they wanted to wear. So, you know, a lot of people said, well, if we respect the rights of other women to wear a miniskirt, why don't they respect the rights of us or our wives to wear headscarves? And that was very common. Even though most of my interviewees generally agreed that wearing a headscarf was a serious religious duty, that wasn't why they were, at least, it wasn't why they were saying they objected to it. And, for example, also among a minority of people that said they supported gender segregation on buses, which sounds, oh, well, that has to be an Islamic thing, a lot of them actually, I think most of them maybe, even said that basically it was so that people wouldn't, like, you know, sexually harass women, which is a real problem in Turkey, unfortunately. The women were actually the most in favor of this that I talked to, so go figure. So Islam is obviously not the only discourse people use to talk about their values, and it's not even necessarily the only reason people see as relevant to why they do things that we might presume are Islamic. So, even for example with the headscarf, some people actually said nothing about why is it important to wear a headscarf. They said, well, it's important so that people don't ogle my wife. I don't like that. Okay. That's functional, but, you know, not necessarily Islam. So all of that's well and good, but isn't it possible that these respondents were, like, sort of concealing their true sinister Islamic motivations from me, much like the AK Party? Well, I really didn't think so, but I did have to sort of devise a way to test that, presuming at least that they weren't outright lying, which, you know, any anthropological or sociological work has to assume. But I basically had to see if one value was sort of stronger than another. So, for example, I asked people what they would do if their daughter, or sometimes sister, came to them announcing that she no longer wanted to wear a headscarf. And I received quite a range of responses here. What united a lot of them overwhelmingly was a sort of sense of failure as a parent. That was the main thing people were saying that they would feel. Moving past that, though, by far the most common answer was that while they would definitely try and persuade their daughter not to take such a decision, only a very small handful actually said that it was a deal-breaking sort of thing where if you do that, you're out of the family, I'm not talking to you again. And some people, you know, a slightly smaller number than that tiny handful, also said it wouldn't make any difference, they don't really care that much. I then began asking what the parents would do if their daughters were to come of age, and the ban on headscarves in university was still in effect. And basically what they said then was that they really didn't want to think about it, but when they were pressed, only a few people said they wouldn't send their daughters to college. Most people seemed torn, but either ended up saying, yeah, the education is more important, she should go even if it means she has to take off the headscarf, or they would say that, you know, I'd leave it up to my daughter, that's her choice. So, one man actually told me that he'd already had this argument with his daughter, and that he'd sort of basically sent her off to college against her will because she really wanted to wear the headscarf, and he said, no, screw that, you're going to be getting a college education, little miss. You know, even though this was a sort of common sort of thing that people do generally feel this is a terribly unjust law, and she had wanted to take a sort of principled stand against it, he said, it's more important that you get an education. So this was probably one of the most clear-cut cases I could find. Religion was not the only priority in people's lives. When push came to shove, most considered their children's future to be more important than even what to them were very clear religious edicts. A real fundamentalist would never allow anything to take precedence over religion, much less mundane secular concerns like education, job security, or money. Thus, genuinely religious concerns do not always win out over others. But not all of my questions yielded such clear results. When I asked people what they thought of the historical Muslim practice of polygamy, people generally seemed caught between a sort of modern aversion to the practice and another sort of desire to defend their Muslim identity against, perceived outside criticism, which they get a lot of over that issue. One man, in fact, began telling me that when he asked me, I hate it, it's completely terrible, what were his thoughts on it, that he was totally against it. But then he moved to explain why, at the time of the Prophet, it was a necessary evil, and he got so wrapped up in his explanation that by the end of it he was asking me, doesn't that make sense? It was literally like a minute or so, maybe 40 seconds of talking, and he'd completely switched directions. And I think this just shows how complicated and contradictory human moral impulses can be, and just how good our minds are at masking these contradictions in familiar discourses. We can really slip from one impulse to another that completely contradicts it without even noticing. So I also asked people about alcohol, and everybody agreed, without exception, that drinking alcohol was a sin. Many quoted a famous hadith saying that it's the mother of all vice. However, a large majority of people were firmly against Turkish cities forbidding alcohol. This actually despite the fact that there was a hadith that says that you should beat people publicly if they drink. I didn't really mention that to most people, but it's there. I think people might know about it. That wasn't factoring in. A lot of people said that in a democracy, people have the right to do what they want, and they were very clear about that. And so no, alcohol is bad, but you can't forbid it through the state. Other people said that actually their objection to it, forbidding it, was because Islam is a religion of tolerance. And they often quoted the very famous Quranic verse that says there is no compulsion in religion. On the other hand, and this is a little less sort of sanguine, everybody I talked to, except for one or two people, seemed to think that the cartoons of the Prophet that came out in Denmark, if you remember a few years ago, and caused such a big scandal, should be illegal. And a couple of people actually looked me in the eye and said, the penalty for that is death! I did some smiling and nodding there. But, evidently no compulsion in religion is something people believe in, but it applies selectively. Though, usually, interestingly, when they talked about the cartoons, they described them as anti-democratic and intolerant, not blasphemous. So that's also something to keep in mind. So when I pointed out to people, for example, that centuries ago, the dominant legal Islamic school in Turkey, Hanafism, had actually endorsed drinking, one woman, a lawyer, point blank refused to accept what I said. No, that can't be true. This is something that some Orientalist manufactured to discredit Islam, is what she said. And I think that it's important to just sort of stress here that what this shows is that Islam cannot possibly be extracted from what people expect Islam to be, if that makes sense. Everybody knows that Islam is against alcohol, so any pieces of evidence that you could find that suggest otherwise are automatically discounted. So a lot of people simply said that the most important thing in Islam was to be a good person. I think a lot of the time secular Western analysis tends to forget just how inextricably tied religion tends to be to everything that devout people care about, whether they're Muslim or not. But this is not because they're fundamentalists that define what they care about around religion. Instead, it's very much the opposite. It's because they're ordinary people who define religion, in this case Islam, around what they care about, if that makes sense. All right, but how can I actually prove that decisively? Inspired by Dr. Haidt's sort of awkward questions, at the end of my interviews I asked some really difficult questions. Basically, I wanted questions that would not just force people into an awkward moral position, and particularly an awkward moral position for which they did not already have a clear roadmap. Like, a lot of people had the apologetic discourse about polygamy. How am I doing on time?
You have some?
Okay. Well, 7 minutes. Yeah.
I'll show you.
Okay. Well, one of the things I asked people was whether they thought slavery was morally acceptable. One or two people actually said it depends. They thought about it for a second first because they were being careful, I think. But overwhelmingly, everybody said no. But of course, that's kind of an issue since it is at least implicitly allowed in the Quran. It tells you what to do with slaves, and it doesn't say you have to set them free immediately, or even that you have to set them free. Basically, I argued with them for a while over it, but inevitably these discussions would lead to a position of historical or cultural relativism. And this was a problem because these people were really sort of stuck. On one hand, nobody's really willing to accept that as a general principle, but it's really, for example, if I asked them, well, okay, if slavery was okay then but not now, we now have modern technology that makes it safe to eat pork. Can we do that? Of course not. So it really had people sort of stuck there. Indeed, basically, though, that the principle is completely anathema to the belief in an eternal and unchanging divine law, but these people, supposedly fundamentalists, are entirely willing to marshal it, the principle, to their defense against the even more unthinkable conclusion that God actually endorses something that intuitively they feel is completely wrong. My sort of grand finale, though, as it were, and I had to save this for the end, otherwise the interview would not get past whenever I asked it. It succeeded in coming straight out of left field. I asked people point blank, do you believe that in the religion of Islam it is acceptable to eat human meat? Unsurprisingly, everybody, without exception, said no, it's not acceptable. Well, why not? Islam is very famous for having such a detailed dietary system that's outlined clearly in the Quran. There's a verse that says, "Say, I do not find anything in what has been inspired to me forbidden for anyone to eat, unless it is dead," meaning carrion, blood poured forth, or pork, for it is filth, or something on which a name other than God has been invoked. Other people are conspicuously absent from this list that says it's complete. So technically, Muslims can eat other people, but not pork. Right? Now, my arguments here are obviously in favor of cannibalism are a bit more involved. I can tell you more about that later if you have questions. But for now, what's important is that the question does have a technically correct answer, but only 2 people ever got it, and only one of them was somebody I interviewed. Instead, what ended up happening was exactly what happened to Dr. Haidt's subjects. They displayed the same behavior. They scowled, they mentioned they felt uncomfortable about the question, they tried to change the subject with things like, do you want to eat a person? Or they laughed nervously, they made unsupported declarations like, that's just how it is. And they'd constantly retreat from their positions. One thing remained constant, though. Even as I systematically stripped away each of their arguments, their judgments did not change. And at the end, I succeeded in getting some people to tell me that they knew it was wrong, but they didn't know why it was wrong. And other people basically tried to avoid the question, saying they didn't know or that they weren't scholars qualified to make a judgment on it. Although they said that they thought it was wrong, even if they weren't sure. But of course, by that point, it's already too late. They very clearly demonstrated that they are not objectively looking through what the texts say about the matter, but actively trying to read the answer they want into the text. This is fundamentally, very fundamentally, contrary to the entire premise of Sunni Islamic orthodoxy, and indeed scriptural moralism or even rational moral theory in general. The entire point of Islamic law is that it provides a comprehensive moral system based on scripture that does not rely on subjective human judgment. In some ways, it might represent actually the ultimate attempt to create a comprehensive, rational basis for all human morality. And I think that's part of why it's both people are very attracted to it and very afraid of it, because that also contends toward totalitarianism. Simply put, though, the mere act of going through a text looking for a particular answer necessarily means the real decision is not being made by the text, but by the reader's conscience. So it's hard to find examples where this shows through quite so unmistakably, and they do end up being weird like this, but that's because religions that are successful tend to lend themselves toward covering the things people tend to care about and believe in. Whether or not it's unmistakable, though, I think we saw it happening with people weighing their different concerns over whether to send their daughter to college, and judging just how important it was to wear a headscarf according to that. Now, there may be some people, perhaps a minority of those people that didn't know the answer, that will say, okay, if it says you can't eat people, I accept that. But I suspect this overwhelmingly reflects more of an insincere attempt to maintain the front of rational consistency rather than genuine moral sentiment. I mean, imagine one of these people actually seeing somebody being eaten. I doubt they would just sort of be like, oh, this is okay. I think they'd be rather distressed. And two, even if we are to take these people's words at face value and assume that they are genuine fundamentalists, this would still exclude everybody I talked to, since they all attempted to avoid this undesirable conclusion. So they certainly do not, people like that are extremely, extremely rare if they exist, and they certainly do not represent the major political and demographic force within Turkey, commonly called Islamists. So, Islamists as such do not really exist in Turkey, at least not in a particularly meaningful way. There are not large numbers of people, shaping their every thought and action around some abstract concept of Islam. There may be some people who say or think that's what they're doing, and there may be others who believe them, but it's simply not true. What is true is that there is a large swath of the Turkish population that is very devout and has very conservative values. And some of them may be trying to cover as many of those values as they can with Islam as a discursive framework. But it doesn't mean that their values have changed because of that. And I've shown you that it's not only is it not the only normative discourse they use, it's also not possible, even with substantial logical gymnastics, to derive all of their values from Islam. So, indeed my subjects really overwhelmingly believed in things like democracy, nationalism, secularism, science, and the rule of law. They may have had different conceptions of it than other people would have, but, the fact is, they do believe in them, whether or not they have reconciled them intellectually or discursively with Islam. So I think in a sense this provides us with a sort of quick and dirty, but accurate, functional answer to the question of whether Islam is compatible with democracy. And the nice thing about this answer is it avoids all the messy philosophical debates on the topic. Functionally, it's quite easy for them to be compatible, if for no other reason than the fact that the sum total of people's beliefs actually do not have to add up rationally. So it's definitely possible. So what are some of the implications for policy here? First of all, as far as policy goes, it should be very clear that the notion that the AK Party has a hidden agenda to radically overthrow the current system, the basis of that is seriously in question, because even the most conservative Muslim supporters of the AK Party don't really want that. Substantively, even the most hardcore supporters of Erdogan do believe in democracy, and they're proud to be Turkish citizens, and also the men at least are proud to have served in the army. Their values are not broadly different from those of most other Turks. Like people everywhere, they are perfectly capable of espousing some values privately without wishing to impose them on the rest of society forcibly. The fact that they may express some of their social and political concerns in Islamic terms is entirely irrelevant. Consequently, a rise in the visible practice of Islam in Turkey should not necessarily be a cause for alarm. Extending this somewhat, we should remember that Islam remains a very powerful discourse throughout the Middle East, and although it does not itself dictate people's values, it does insert itself as a discourse into people's lives in a lot of places. So it's extremely important not to mistake, images of Turks dressing in baggy pants or chadors, or hundreds of, thousands of Egyptians praying in Tahrir Square, or a lot of Libyans excitedly waving guns and shouting Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, for indications that some sort of terrible Islamic state is imminent. And indeed, if there is a state that calls itself Islamic, I think it's far more important to examine the substance and structure of the state than to get caught up in the name. That's not saying there's nothing to worry about in any of these circumstances, but if we do see worrying patterns of behavior, people who sound like fundamentalists will need to address those particular patterns and not Islam. So, if people are beating their wives, you have to ask, why were their fathers beating them, not why Islam encourages domestic violence. And if people are willing to kill over perceived slights to the Prophet, or for that matter, Ataturk, we really need to seriously ask what about these people's lives has led them to this profound insecurity, and not why Islam is so intolerant. Obviously, neither of these are easy questions, but we can be pretty certain that attacking, or promoting actually, Islam is not going to address any of them. On the contrary, really, attacking Islam is only going to make things worse by compounding the sort of insecurity by making people's identities feel threatened. And this definitely applies in Turkey, where statistics have shown that over the last 10 years, devout Muslims have been on the ascendant politically and economically, yet at the same time, the number of Turks desiring Sharia law has plummeted from 24% to 10%. And I think this lesson applies elsewhere in the world. Finally, I'd like to conclude by saying that I think on one hand it's obviously completely wrong and distorted to presume that because someone adheres to some elements of what we expect Islam to look like, they necessarily conform to the rest of our stereotype. And, people can fast during Ramadan and avoid usury without wanting to reestablish a caliphate or blow up buildings. The importance of looking at Muslims as people, not as an ideology, cannot be overstated. On the other hand, I think it's equally dangerous to simply give Muslims a pass for things that are quote-unquote part of their religion. If a person advocates stoning someone to death, I think they should be held accountable, personally accountable, for that view. The fact that they can cite a scriptural passage in support of it is far less relevant than their own desire to see it happen, or alternatively, their sort of obsessive desire for consistency which stands between them and their conscience. Thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Koppel.
Thank you. That was very thought-provoking, and I'm sure that this will engender a lot of questions, and I have a quick question to ask.
Okay.
And that is, in the beginning, I really liked the idea of finding people who had voted, one for the KP, and checking through voting, what the preferences were. My question to you is, if you had to go back and do it again, what other question? Is there a question in there that you would have liked to have asked that you didn't?
Yes, there are a lot.
Also, what's the answer to the cannibalism question?
Oh, does anybody think they know that, first of all? Unless I've told you, that's cheating.
They didn't vote for that one.
The first person that ever got it was actually, and I didn't know it at the time, they informed me, and then I realized there was an answer, was actually Georgetown's own Imam Yahya Hindi. And he sort of looked at me when I asked him that. I was trying to stump him, and he's like, of course not. The thing is, you have duties as a Muslim that if somebody dies, you have to bury them. And if you're burying them, you're not eating them. So you would be committing a sin by not burying them.
What if you're on a lifeboat?
I think you have to throw them into the water. But yeah, you could kind of do that.
That's gonna be his next question.
Yeah. I'll think about what I need to ask you for now. Yeah.
But what question would you have brought in as well? Apart from cannibalism, perhaps.
Well, I would have really liked to ask a sort of control question for some of the things to test various aspects of how their minds were working on sort of other issues. They're not coming to my mind exactly what they were at the moment. They weren't things I mentioned in here.
Yeah.
But I think it would have made things a little bit stronger. I think I asked a lot of good questions. There are some questions I wish I could have asked, but even if I went back, I still wouldn't have asked them. And that's because as an American, and for the sake of disclosure, I am myself Muslim, which is probably the only reason any of these people really agreed to talk to me. It's sad but true. There's still a lot of suspicion, and especially when the Institutional Review Board requires that you get signed forms, Turks are very suspicious of that, even if it's Turks they know asking them to do it. And I really had to do everything I could not to appear to be an Orientalist, a missionary, or a spy. And a couple of questions, like, I would really like to know what people's opinions were about domestic violence, but I think it's kind of too painful and too taboo, really, to even bring up. At least with somebody that you've just met relatively recently. And, I would have liked to ask about, a couple of other sort of things like that. Why people are convinced that Islam is the right religion, but I figure if I ask people stuff like that, implicitly it means, oh, he's trying to make me a Christian or something. He's not really Muslim. The interview is over. So that's sort of a thing.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, a question about the honor killings. I saw recently a wonderful film, probably the best film I've seen all year, When We Leave. In German it's called Die Fremde, The Foreigner. And it was a German-Turkish film, and it had the same star, I think her name is Sybil Gebelli, who was in Head On by Fatih Akin.
Oh, yeah.
And marvelous performance, but it had to do with his family's sense of outraged honor when she tries to flee an abused relationship with her son. And it's interesting that the younger sister is also in an honor problem. She's pregnant by her fiancé, but in that case, there's a scene where the father is sitting in a cab with the father of the groom, pays him some money, and that's taken care of. They get married right away. But in this case, the honor to the family, it's a horrendous conclusion. And the question I had throughout this, how much of this do you attribute to Islam?
None of it.
Or, well, I ended up, the other is more to deep family relationships and cultural factors.
Well, this is exactly.
And I ended up finally saying I doubt if Islam comes into it very much.
It doesn't
These
come
aren't
into
even practicing Islam very much in Berlin.
Yes, I mean, it's kind of, I guess, I hate it when people say it's not politically incorrect because it's true, but it is true and also unfortunately politically correct that a lot of the people that had sort of the most extreme views were sort of the most marginal citizens of Turkey. They were usually from ethnic minorities, and usually they tended to be poorer. I think I remember somebody that grew up without like electricity, that he was one of the people that said that people should be killed for, insulting the Prophet. And he was also ethnically Arab. Not that, not saying anything general about the Arabs or anything, but, and there was that, a lot of the Zazas that I talked to, I did some of my interviews in Bingo, had extremely traditional is kind of more of a euphemism, sort of, I don't know, the views about women and stuff that made me uncomfortable. And they didn't necessarily know that much about Islam. One of the guys sort of did, but a lot of them really didn't. But it really is an entirely cultural thing. In fact, in Islam, there's really nothing about killing your relatives because of honor. Honor is actually something that is very conspicuously absent from the Quran if you look at it, even though it was a tremendous part of pre-Islamic Arabian society and current society throughout most of the Middle East. If you want to look at it from a sort of religious perspective, it's really not something that really comes into play that much. But it's another value that people have, and so they do tend to put it in with Islam.
The irony is that the woman in the film, she herself was disowned by her Turkish family. Because the Boulevard Press in Germany found out she had appeared in porno films before. And that was too much for her family.
I mean, I think getting pregnant is one thing, but being in pornographic... That is genuinely scandalous, but, that's... I don't know if you should be disowned, but... Well, you know, everybody. I'm just sort of saying, trying to imagine what that would do to an American family. I doubt many parents would be really thrilled about that. Maybe some of them would, but usually not. Yes.
Well, thanks for your talk. It's very interesting.
You're welcome.
I'm just worried that 30, you can make really strong conclusions from just interviewing 30 people.
Yes.
In a population of 7 million. But I missed you said what areas of Turkey you interviewed people.
Sure.
And also, did you ask, one thing I'm wondering is what reasons people gave for voting for AKP? Did they give religious reasons for voting for
No, nobody. Well, that's not true. Not nobody. Overwhelmingly, the reasons they had for that were actually a little bit disappointing. I had thought that would be a very interesting question, but it wasn't. A lot of them said, "I really like Erdogan," you know, and you know, he's the head of the party, but it doesn't really tell you that much. Mostly, they just said, you know, I like their economic policies. They're moving the country forward. Some people did say that it was a sort of Islamic candidate, but very, very few. As to your question about, and I mean, it's more complex than that, actually. I can tell you more about it later, but your question about interviewing 30 people is a real sort of sticking point for this. Functionally, it's just not possible to do this kind of a study with substantially more people than this. I did interview 35 people. I'm only including 30 because 5 of them it kind of really angered me, actually, because we were most of the hours into the interview, and they said, "Wait, why did I vote for the Rafah Party? I never voted for them." So I had to exclude those. These people were usually further to the, I guess, to the Islamic side of the spectrum and voted for the more radical party still. But the thing is, it's not so much about statistics as mental processes. And if you find in 30 people that you're getting a consistent thing, it's likely to be, depending on, you know, the percentage and stuff, there's a margin of error there. It's likely to be pretty substantial. I mean, the cannibalism thing, for example, I think that applies pretty much across the board. You could ask any Muslim in this room, well, not now, maybe, but before, you could have asked them the same question, you'd have gotten the same answer. Yeah, and also they're taken from a very specific sector of society, so it's not really trying to represent, you know, 70 million people. It's sort of, I don't know, maybe 5, which still that.
And what geographic area did you?
Geographic, yes. I did half of the interviews in various areas in Istanbul. A lot of them were in Fatih. Some of them were in a slum called Arnavutköy, not to be confused with the fancy Arnavutköy on the Boğaz. Yeah. Yeah, well, when I heard that there were somebody was living there, I'm like, wow, that's really fancy. I was like,
There
wow.
are 2, I know that.
There are 2, yeah. You have to look for the other one, believe me. It's like, anyway. But the, and then some of them were in, like, some fancier districts downtown. But the other half were between Konya, Erzurum, Bingöl, and Kars. So pretty good Anatolian sort of selection there.
They were from those cities, or you?
No, I went to those cities. I mean, a lot of the people in Istanbul were also from some of those cities too, as it happened. But you know, that kind of happens when you're in Istanbul, that people are from places like that. Yes.
What was the, did you control for economic status? Like, did you look at their incomes and?
I did. I asked people in, only like one person actually sort of felt remotely embarrassed about it. Like, I guess it's a cultural thing, but I put that right at the beginning with the sort of biographical info, and I wasn't really sure if that would be sort of a turnoff for people, but it didn't seem to bother them. Mostly, people made, I think, you know, 1,500 to 2,000 lira a month, I believe, which I think is about average nationally. It seemed like a pretty representative group, actually. I had people that were quasi-literate. I mean, I think they'd finished middle school. Haircutters in Bingöl that, you know, mostly spoke Zaza and were really struggling to make ends meet. I met somebody that had gotten fired from his job a while ago and was just sort of miserable. And then I also talked to someone that was like a market executive, lawyer, and some mid-level politicians anyway. So it really ran the sort of gamut.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I thank you for the insight. I think it was a very well written and thought work. But maybe if I may, I can maybe add a contribution,
Please.
a small one. For most of the secularists in Turkey, they think that they feel that they're pressured usually during certain times of the year, which is Ramadan.
Absolutely.
One of them is.
It's a huge concern.
They can't sleep. They can't drink alcohol. They can't put on clothes the way they want. They normally do.
Yeah.
So I always thought that Islamism appears in different forms in different countries. Like in Indonesia, it's a different version. In Iran, it's a different version, and obviously in Turkey,
it takes that form.
So that's why I always thought describing Islamism under people who want Sharia. And who want to live by Sharia, I always thought it's a shortcoming. I mean, it's a shortcoming, basically, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
So that's why, just because that sort of Islamism doesn't exist, or that you think it doesn't exist, doesn't mean that a different sort of Islamism does not exist in Turkey.
Excellent point. I actually did ask questions about that. I remember a couple of years ago, I had sort of become friends with this guy who was a sort of Zaza Alevi from Tunceli, who are both sort of Shiites, so they've got the sort of Islam card against them, as far as most Turks are concerned. And they're not Turkish, so they've got the ethnic thing against them. So his dad was actually a member of parliament, and he owned a business, and he was pretty successful, actually. And he said, you know, I'm sad to say this, but I have to get the hell out of this country. I can't take it here anymore. And I asked him why. I mean, he was working in like downtown Ankara, and he had a nice house somewhere out in one of the suburbs. And he said, you know, it just sort of, it's just not a good sort of thing. You know, people in Ramadan, I have to, you know, basically fast, and people keep staring at my wife if I walk through the wrong neighborhood because she's not wearing a headscarf. What business is it of theirs? And so I asked people. I didn't ask them, what do you think of women that don't wear headscarves? Because, you know, that could kind of get a little testy. But I did ask them, what would you do if you saw somebody walk by your store in the middle of Ramadan eating? And I got a very interesting range of responses. Nobody said that they would actually say anything, but you're right. It's a lot of it is just the way people look at you, and you can feel it, and that's a real thing. And it was sort of heartening to hear that a lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people did say that I wouldn't think anything. Maybe I'd be a little upset, but I certainly wouldn't do anything. Some people said I wouldn't even be upset. I don't know. That person could be sick. They could be, if it's a woman, they could be pregnant, or, you know, could be a certain time of Ramadan, or something like that. I've got no idea what these people are doing. They might not even be Muslim. It's really not my business. And I think there is a real sense of that. But at the same time, from the Muslim perspective, or the observant perspective, if you see somebody eating and you're trying not to eat, it makes it harder. So there's kind of a give and take with that, especially if it's done publicly. So yeah, that is actually a very important point, though. Thank you for bringing that up.
I'm just saying, as a contribution to the literature, I mean, scholars should include different definitions of Islamism.
Absolutely.
Because the definition of Islamism, or the Islamist way of life, is actually covers a very small population in the Islamic world.
Absolutely.
Very, very. And those people are fundamentalists. The majority of Muslims are moderate people.
Exactly.
And I think that lifestyle requires a different definition of Islamism, because they still live by Quran. They still try to, you know, pray 5 times a day. They fast.
Exactly.
You know, they live by some certain moral codes that is related to religion. So that's why I said maybe you might want to include Turkish version of Islamism.
Will do. Other questions?
Any other questions?
Somebody has to have something.
Well, we are past the 1 o'clock hour, so you got one?
I'm not sure if they would, you sounded like you expected them to somehow perceive of Islamic law as strictly textual, sort of analysis of the Quran.
Yeah.
The majority of Islamic history, people had many different sources.
Absolutely.
They include stories, they include hadith, they have various law schools. So
yes,
he might not necessarily see democracy as you seem to put it outside Islam. They don't necessarily see that outside or in opposition.
No,
but
it's not. No.
You seem to kind of expect that they would have to abide by the textual. That would only prove that they were a literal sort of literalist.
Yes. I think one of the reasons I decided to write a whole dissertation on all of this, boy, that's going to be fun when I get all that cranked out, but is basically because, I mean, I agree with you completely, and there is this sort of sense that that is what, you know, at least fundamentalists, we could even say activist Muslims, that would be more accurate, and probably even most devout Muslims are. And you see that repeatedly all over the news, all over, unfortunately, even academic sort of stuff. This is how it's treated. There is a very important other dimension of Islam, of course, and this is even true with Orthodox Islam, of the sort of most legalistic kind, that says that there is a component of it which is, you know, a very personal spiritual thing, which is sort of your relationship with God. And that's very important, and there are definitely varieties of Islam, especially ones that are very active in Turkey, especially Sufism, or in an extreme case, Alevism. You know, I guess some people don't put that under Islam, but regardless, they basically tend to emphasize those more than the sort of legalistic aspects of things. You know, those obviously have a very different sort of character to them. I think, though, the thing that everybody is afraid of is not that people are going to, you know, have all these spiritual feelings. It's that they're going to impose Islamic law. And so I think that's kind of what I wanted to address here.
But that's precisely the point. How clear-cut is that Islamic law, anyway?
It's not. It's completely not. I mean, when somebody, I originally had this in here, I had to cut it out for the sake of time. One of the guys I talked to, a couple of them actually, when I said, you can't really ask people if they support Sharia, because I think it's probably in violation of a number of Turkish laws, or it used to be at least. I'm not a legal expert, but I'm pretty sure it's not the best political move, especially when I'm recording these. So I asked people, do you think that the Refah party was trying to bring about Islamic law, and would you have supported them if you did? And a couple of people told me, well, you know, when I asked them, so, well, what is Islamic law? What do you think it means? It's like, what comes to your mind when you hear about a Sharia system? It's like, we have a Sharia system now. Which, you know, I mean, by most people's definitions that you would expect, it's completely untrue. It's a secular system. But in fact, what he said was, you know, I live my life according to the dictates of Islamic law. I wake up in the morning, I pray, I fast during Ramadan, you know, and I don't eat pork. What else is there in the Sharia? And that's a completely valid point. So, yeah, it's not such a clear-cut distinction at all.
How is that valid?
What?
How is that valid? I mean, the Sharia is huge. It's all-encompassing, and also
huge.
within Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, the Sharia was never the single source of law. They were, you know,
well,
you had Kanun, you had
this is the
all
thing.
these systems.
There have never, in the history of Islam, been states that lasted more than, you know, a couple of years that really tried to make Islamic law the only thing that governs them. I mean, for one thing, for example, according to traditional juridical procedures, if you see somebody coming out of a building with a bloody knife, and you find somebody stabbed inside the building, you need, first of all, 2 witnesses to prove that the person was there with the bloody knife, and then the judge can't even conclude that he was the killer based on that. It just proves that he had a bloody knife. So, I mean, it's not necessarily the most practical, it's not at all a practical way to run a society, strictly using that. All Islamic societies have also had a sort of royal law that they used, or a secular law, so to speak, to supplement this. And, you know, it's very ahistorical when a lot of people say we need to be ruled only by Sharia law, and some people do say that. Nobody's ever only been ruled by Sharia law, except during the time of the Prophet, and that's kind of different because everything he said was automatically sort of Sharia law.
Can I add to that one?
Yeah.
Well, I think if someone doesn't know a thing, he can go and learn. If someone misunderstood things, I don't know what to do. The whole throughout the things about this understanding of the Sharia, that the huge, or comparing with the secular law and then the religious law, that the Quran gives a very basic structure.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of it, we don't need to call the secular, but we all use the normal law, that whatever the common law has been established here.
Sort of law.
So I mean that as long as that this whatever the practical law that you established is not contradicted with the Quran,
right,
then you can call the Sharia. So
yes,
you can call that the America, as long as it doesn't contradict with the basic rules of the Quran. I'm not talking about the rest of the other stuff, but basically Quran. Yeah. So you can call it the Sharia, which means the law, basically.
Exactly.
So that so we shouldn't get confused about this thing. And then the Sharia is not a huge. It's actually very small. I mean that you can take like maybe 100 basic perspective. The rest of it, it's all about the development of the society. And then another lady over there that during the Ramadan that you couldn't wear the stuff in Turkey in certain areas, that have you ever tried to walk in the street here in Georgetown with wearing a hijab? I think that we should be asking that question. Whatever that this is nothing to do with the Islam, or this is nothing to do with the religion, but the people are always staring at what is not known to them, foreign to them. So it's something to do with that. I don't think that they are forcing their belief consciously.
Interesting point.